Welcome to Writer to Writer. I am Mary Sue Koeppel, the editor of Calliope, and with me today is Ruth Kempher, who is a wonderful novelist, poet, short story writer, as well as an editor and owner of her own publishing company. We have a Renaissance woman sitting here with us today.
Well, that's very nice of you to say.
Well, I'm delighted that you're here with us. Ruth, would you tell us a little bit about your background? You've just told me you've published 19 books of poetry.
Right. Well, I was born in New Jersey.
Okay.
But I've lived in Florida about 35 years, since it's more than that now. I arrived in 1960 in Florida. Mm-hmm. By the time I arrived here, I was just on the brink of beginning to publish poetry quite a bit in the early 60s. And I was here for a while without knowing quite what I was doing, other than being here with my husband, who was at Green Cove Springs with the Navy. And then we settled on St. Augustine because we loved it. It's such a beautiful place. And I still didn't know what I was doing. We built the White Lion Bar, which I don't think you knew. Speaking of my being a Renaissance woman, I've also been a bartender and a shrimp cleaner and all kinds of things with the White Lion Bar.
Which is why you're so good as a performance artist.
Oh, really? Maybe so. I have put up with a lot of drunks, I know, and performed, I suppose. But I went back to school then when Flagler College opened in 1968. And
by then
I had published quite a bit by then, so they hired me as a teacher of creative writing, and instead of paying me money, they let me take all the classes I wanted to take. So I graduated from Flagler College cum laude with majors in English, Spanish, and creative art. I took everything I could take. And at the end of that, I had my bachelor's degree, and I got divorced. And that's sort of the way things happened to me. Then I went to Emory and got my master's and came back and taught for St. John's River Community College in St. Augustine, which was just beginning then.
And all the while you were writing?
Yes. Oh, yes.
So you started out, though, you were
writing and publishing.
You were telling me that you started out in the mainstream press.
Yes. Before I came to Florida, my first writing efforts, I didn't know anything about the small press. I didn't know anything about college journal writing. I only knew about Saturday Evening Post and McCall's. There were several places that used good poetry and would pay, and I tried them. And I was awfully lucky. I began to get these checks. And I thought, oh, this is wonderful. But then after they've given you a few checks, they decide, well, we've used you. So then what do I do with all this poetry, which was still coming?
Well, name some of these mainstream places that were published.
Oh, well, I actually had a serious poem in TV Guide. They gave me a whole page. It wasn't terribly serious, actually. But I thought it was serious, and it was about television, so I sent it in to them, and they paid me $150. I was amazed.
Can't knock that.
They have never had another poem, I don't think, after mine. Not a serious poem. It was.
Well, congratulations.
It was even free verse. So,
and then you discovered the world of.
Yes, I was lucky enough to get in contact with a man here in Florida named Jerry Burns, who encouraged me by sending me lists of places to send my work. He said, "This is where you should send everything you write." So through him, I discovered the whole world of the small press. And now, of course, I own a small press of my own. So
well, now, how did you make that jump? What
that
moved you
leap
to become an editor and a publisher?
I wanted to bring out one book of poetry, particularly with illustrations. And I happened to have marvelous illustrations because I had by that time met a man named Wayne Hogan, who's an excellent illustrator. And I couldn't find anyone who would publish or would accept poetry along with illustrations. No one wants to do it. For one thing, you have to use better paper when you're using illustrations, and most small presses don't want to go to the extra expense. So when I realized that no one was going to do it for me, I decided, well, I think I'll do it myself. And about that time, I got the Washington Prize for a novel. I keep having novels win prizes for money, and then they never get published, which nobody understands, including me. But I took that money and I published the Prattsburgh Correspondence, which was the first book from King's Estate Press. It was supposed to be the only book, but people saw that book and liked it and asked me if I couldn't get them in touch with Wayne to do the illustrations, and wouldn't I also like to bring it out from my press. And we've gone on, we're about to do our 20th book all of a sudden. So you never know how things are going to come out.
The last book that I know of that came out of your press is My Shameless St. Augustine Scrapbook. And I just wanted to talk about this kind of printing for a minute, because it's not only modern poetry that you're putting in here and contemporary writers, but you've gone back and pulled out some of the fine writers of the, the last 200 years.
This was so much fun for me. I just love doing this because it is a scrapbook, and it is rather shameless of me, I suppose. But it was just fun to do. Incidentally, your work was fun to edit. It's wonderful when you're a writer and you get to edit someone who has edited you. It's really
thank
incredible.
You. It was my pleasure to be in here. But what I wanted to mention is you are using some of the work of very famous writers.
Yes.
I mention a couple of them, would you?
Well, Harriet Beecher Stowe's in here, and James Weldon Johnson. People with connections to the St. Augustine area, mostly. Some of it is a little far-fetched, but pretty close. And then I've just gone after some work that I wanted to use.
Well, I see some very famous names in here, like who am I trying to say?
Okay.
McNeish. Yeah.
Well, now, that's one of my favorite poems. I knew that he lived in our lighthouse park for some time, so I thought, well, he can be in here, certainly. And I've often referred to his poems about Eve. That happens to be an Eve poem. And I paid for that. I had to do all the correspondence. That's the thing that I discovered takes enormous amounts of time and energy, paying for permissions to reprint.
Well, when you go after an Archibald MacLeish, and I see a William Bartram and an Andrew Marvell.
Well, now William Bartram, having been dead for the length of time he's been gone, there's no one around.
And his estate is not coming after you.
At least no one has, no one's showed up for his check, not yet. I'd be happy to, though, because I'm so pleased to have him in there.
When we talk about a book like this, we're dealing with poetry of place, are we not?
Yes.
And one of the things it seems to me that you are very good at is the poetry of place, the poetry of our part of Northeast Florida.
Well, thank you.
Would you comment about that a little bit and how that figures into your writing, both your novels as well as your short stories and your poetry?
Well, I think I'm a little bit under the spell of Marjorie Canaan Rawlings, actually. I belong to the society which is trying to keep her, her spirit alive. But she was another person who came down from the north and discovered great wellsprings of subject material and the people that she loved, and probably would not have been able to be such a fine writer had she stayed up north, and I feel that way about myself. So that may be part of it. It could be, too, that people who are born here don't always appreciate what they've got. They look around, but they don't really, it's not new to them, so they don't, it doesn't occur to them to write it down and try to capture it. But someone who finds it exotic is going to try to capture it.
Well, people have rewarded you for some of the efforts that you have made.
Yes, I've been very, very lucky and very blessed. I feel that.
Well, I'm looking at the pen, or the pin, which is hanging.
Yes, this is Mr. William Faulkner. I'm very proud of him. This was a prize that I won in 1995 from the Pirates Alley William Faulkner Society, and that was, again, a very nice monetary award. They also published it, the short story. I am going to make an admission which I don't normally make. It wasn't a short story, it was a novel chapter, but it's too late for them to take the money back. I brought out a book with my short story in it, and 2 other short stories by 2 other wonderful ladies, and that's what I used that money for.
You were going to read us a speck of it.
Just a little bit. I read this in Paris before it was actually published, because I was on my way to Paris when I found out that I had won the prize, and then my instructor in Paris, I was taking a course, and my instructor asked me please to read some. So this is the piece that I read in a bar in Paris. It was very informal. I'll try to remember the taste of the scotch. I found out about the time that I was heading for Paris that I'd won the prize, and I couldn't put off the Paris trip, but they also wanted me to come to New Orleans, which was really hard to take, so I had to rearrange my trip. But the people in Paris asked me to read, and I read very informally in a Paris bar, and it may help if you see me moving my hand, I'm holding my drink now, my scotch. This is in the middle of the story. I'm only going to read a small bit, but this is a part of the chapter of a story called The Scrabble Game. So you have to sort of imagine that there are 4 people playing Scrabble. There are 2 couples, 2 husbands and 2 wives. There is one couple named Tonio and Lynn, and the other is Beth and Jonah. And if you've read my work, you know that Beth appears quite frequently, and Jonah as well, her husband. Poor Joe, he appears. We're in a kitchen and we're playing Scrabble. Lynn put down Beth hooking up to Hates and stood up. There had been beer through the early afternoon and coffee and wine with the spaghetti, and now she wanted us to finish the Chianti so it won't turn to vinegar on Mama. She fetched the bottle back to the table with glasses all around. I waited for Tonio's move, not trying to think ahead as I supposed I should, but slipping behind. Bath. You could trace a history of my life through various bathrooms, down one vile-smelling school corridor to another, always searching for the ladies' room, always urgency and haste. At home, Surfside, our bathroom walls are enameled Van Gogh's yellow, color of love. It's all yours, Beth, said Tonio, as Lynn sat back, fluffing her copper haze of hair. He nudged my foot, this time running what felt like his big toe coyly around my ankle. I was nice to you for a change. I saw what he had done for me while my mind had wandered. He had added the word elm to the board, right below the H of Bath, so that H-E, he, was made under Bath and elm, with his M stuck out toward the edge of the board, giving me a wide-open shot at the triple word square. Elm. I thought of the huge elms on Harrison Street in Fort Wayne, Indiana, where Jonah and I had our first apartment. Elm trees rustled, heavy-leaved that summer, with train soot on their leaves. Trains whistled through the night, and elms had strange secret whispers as I walked back and forth to the little German grocery place around the corner, or hauled books back to the public library, murmuring still as I came home with new books. Those elms were big, fat female creatures, gossiping or, after rain, sucking on chocolate-covered cherries. Lots of noise in the leaves. M is for mine, my turn. Beth said, Jonah, are you trying? Oh, I am. Seriously, I was trying to make sense. The silly old lady who shared our bathroom must be dead by now. She never remembered to unlock our door on her side when she was through. And I worried so about our noise because our bedroom backed up to hers. Tonio's foot moved lazily up and down the plump side of my leg near my knee, and that did not help. I am thinking of bathrooms. What's the name of this game? Everyone laughed except Lynn, who answered Scrabble, as if I'd asked something real. Then she jumped up again, nervous. You keep thinking, Beth. We all know it's difficult. I'll go check on my babies while you're figuring out what to do.
I love the way you play with words.
Oh, yeah. That's years of Scrabble playing, probably, as well as writing poetry, of course.
Yes, of course. When there are so many things I wanted to ask you, and such a little bit of time here. Mm-hmm. Tell me, when you publish poetry, you've used some pseudonyms, right?
Yes, I have.
Such as?
Well, I've been Sylvia Savage. As a matter of fact, Sylvia Savage is writing a novel right now.
And her persona is?
Well, she's the traveling person.
Good,
and there's Rutabaga Rose, who had a story in Calliope, actually.
Yes, of course.
She's the kind of old-fashioned homey person.
Okay.
She knows about jams and jellies and things like that.
And?
Hilda Halfhart is the student. Hilda Halfhart does funny rhyming things.
The student meaning the high school, the college?
College, probably. The college. Rather pedantic, I'm afraid.
Yes, I remember the footnotes.
Yes, she does copious footnotes.
One of the things that you do when you are doing all of your research is add to the knowledge that we really have in literature. You're doing a study right now of prose poetry.
Yes, that will be one of the next, that's our next big project from the press, and it keeps growing. I, as a teacher, found that there were very few texts that you could use in trying to explain what prose poetry is, and so I've just gone into the whole background of it. I've got some Baudelaire, some of the French writers. I found that Proust wrote prose poetry, which not everyone knows, and Garcia Lorca also. So I'm including those. And then tremendous numbers of modern poets who are writing prose poetry and who have written me their comments as well as their poems.
What discoveries have you made as you've done this?
Well, mostly that nobody agrees about what prose poetry actually is. There are very few, except that you usually write to the end of the page, instead of chopping off line ends, and it's more like prose. But beyond that, you can fit an awful lot of odd things into prose poetry, which makes it a very nice medium, actually, for a poet.
Well, are there some common threads that some of these people say?
Very few. When you read the book, you'll be astonished how many different ways people have been able to use prose poetry. List poems, poems that look like diary entries. I think Sylvia probably could write prose poetry. Her carnal musings fit fairly well into prose poetry.
One of your
perhaps.
own personas.
Yes. Good old Sylvia.
When is this book to be published?
It was to be published 6 months ago, but
okay.
But I'm afraid I've been busy, and I've discovered this is a book that I'm trying to be very careful about the permissions on, and I'm having a terrible time. I had a beautiful piece of writing by Samuel Beckett that I've been dickering about for 6-10 months, and they want so much money, his estate, that I'm afraid Beckett's not going to be in the book, but that sort of thing has held me up. It should be out in about 2 months, I think. I'm finishing it up right now.
I look forward to that. What do you think is happening today with modern poetry?
I think it's marvelous that so many people are writing poetry. I wish more of them were writing good poetry. It's been diluted, I think.
Now I'm going to put you on the spot.
Right.
Prose poetry, good poetry.
Prose poetry is just like any other kind of poetry. It's very difficult to write very good prose poetry.
And how do you know when you have it?
Just like Emily says, the top of your head comes off when you read it.
Yes.
It is a poetry form, and it is a form. I have, unfortunately, part of the book is a set of comments from editors, some of them who do not use prose poetry, and their comments generally say there is no form, so we can't use it. We don't consider it a form because it's so formless, but it's not, because the square is a form after all, and the paragraph is a form also. So it is, though, a ruled kind of world. It is not as free verse, and as you know, there's a great deal of very bad free verse written in the name of poetry. So
people who are listening are perhaps saying to themselves, and what is a good poem? You're an editor. How do you make that choice?
I think it's a personal thing. It's my book. It's, in your case, it would be your magazine. If you like the poem, you put it in. It's a good poem. And what makes a good poem, I'm not always sure. Sometimes it's the craft, and sometimes it's a turn of expression or a turn of mind, something that's surprising, something that's magic that happens in the words. And it's always good word use, whether it's prose or poetry, or prose poetry.
Mm-hmm. Do you see that becoming more and more powerful in the mainstream, or do you just see prose poetry as something kind of off
Well,
on the side?
It's been a fad before. Back in the 70s, there was a great deal of interest in the prose poem, and then it sort of disappeared. Now it's coming back again, or seems to be, because I have had many inquiries about the book. People want to use it for classes, and people who are interested in finding out what I know about it because they can't figure it out either. And in a way, I'm sorry I can't say that there's a hard and fast rule.
Well, I went to a workshop in Washington, D.C., in which several of these very famous prose writers were sitting on a panel, and they began the panel by saying, "You may not ask us this question: what is a prose poem?" And Robert Bly was even on that panel.
Yes, well, I have a great deal of Robert Bly because he's been very vocal about the prose poem. He loves it, and he's marvelous. And he is one person, incidentally, who's wonderful to deal with. He has a secretary who tries to find you versions that you won't have to pay for, which I think is exceedingly nice.
We have only a few minutes left, Ruth.
Yes.
May people send you poetry, or are you looking for manuscripts, or is this...
I'm afraid right now I would prefer people not to. People do. I'm listed in several places, the press is. But I have to answer everyone that right for the moment I am scheduled for things to come out for the next 2 years. And I don't want to go beyond that. I don't want to look. If the Pope sent me a manuscript, I couldn't look at it. I'm sorry, but that's about the way it is.
Well, Ruth, we look forward to all of the books that come out of your press. We look forward to the books that come from your hand.
Well, thank you.
We look forward to the workshops that you have given, or that you will give all around the country. You have given them around.
I have done several, yes.
The United States as well as in other countries. It has been my pleasure to work a little bit this afternoon with Ruth Moon Kempher, a poet, a short story writer, and a novelist from St. Augustine, Florida. Thank you for joining us, and Writer to Writer, I'm Mary Sue Koeppel from FCCJ. Thank you.